Something to keep in mind when we're talking about the diffusion of gases across the respiratory membrane is the respiratory rate, or how quickly the gases are able to diffuse across the membrane. Because remember, the blood doesn't just come into the lungs and then stop and wait while we unload all of the CO2 and load up all of the oxygen, and then it goes on. The blood is moving through the lungs continually, and if the respiratory rate isn't fast enough, the blood will leave the lungs before the gas has been fully exchanged, so the blood won't be fully oxygenated or won't have unloaded all of its carbon dioxide. So the respiratory rate is very important. So in this section, I want to talk about several factors that affect the respiratory rate. The first one is the pressure difference. The greater the difference in the partial pressure between the air in the lungs and the blood, the faster diffusion will take place. So if we have a big difference between the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs and the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, then the oxygen will diffuse more quickly. If we have a small difference between the partial pressures, then diffusion is going to happen more slowly. Let me give you two situations where this makes a difference. The first one would be at high altitudes. When you're at a high altitude, the surrounding air, including the partial pressure of oxygen, is lower. With a lower partial pressure of oxygen, that means we have less difference between the partial pressure of oxygen in our lungs and the partial pressure of oxygen in our blood. That means that the oxygen is going to diffuse more slowly from the lungs into the blood because there's a smaller pressure difference. This is part of what makes you feel tired if you're at a high altitude, is the fact that with slower diffusion, your blood is exiting the lungs before it can always get fully oxygenated. Your body tries to compensate for that by making more red blood cells that can grab onto the oxygen better, and that can help with the diffusion. Another situation where this is important is when you're in a medical setting and actually giving somebody oxygen. When you are administering oxygen through a mask, you are putting a higher partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs compared to a lower partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. That's a bigger pressure difference when you're administering oxygen, and you get faster diffusion. Another factor that affects the rate of diffusion is the temperature. The warmer the temperature, the faster the diffusion. So you're going to be able to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with warm air more quickly than you can with cool air. This is one of the reasons why it's important to make sure we warm the air as it's coming into our lungs. Warm air will have a faster diffusion and we'll get better exchange of gases. A third factor that makes a difference is the thickness of the respiratory membrane. We already talked about the fact that a thin respiratory membrane is important if we're going to be able to get fast exchange of oxygen from the lungs into the blood and from the blood into the lungs. Usually the respiratory membrane is only about a half a micron thick, and that includes the squamous alveolar cell and the basement membrane and the squamous cell around the capillary. Anything that makes that membrane thicker is going to slow down the rate of diffusion. An example of something that would increase the respiratory membrane thickness would be congestive heart failure. We talked a little bit about that in the cardiac section. If the right side of your heart is working normally, but the left side of the heart is weaker, then the right side of the heart will pump more blood up to the lungs than the left side is pumping out to the body. That raises the pressure in your lungs and causes more fluid to be pushed out of the blood vessels in the lungs into the respiratory membrane. That thickens the respiratory membrane and slows the rate of diffusion. Another example of something that would thicken the respiratory membrane would be pneumonia. Pneumonia is caused by a buildup of fluid in the lungs. As you can see from this picture, compared to a normal respiratory membrane, pneumonia causes a thickening of the respiratory membrane due to the additional fluid that's found around the alveoli. This is going to decrease the diffusion rate. Another situation where we see thickened membranes like this would be any sort of inflammation of the lung. Anything that's going to cause inflammation in the lungs results in swelling, one of the classic signs of inflammation, and that's going to thicken the respiratory membrane and decrease the diffusion rate. The last factor that makes a difference when we're talking about diffusion rate is just the amount of respiratory membrane. The greater the area of the respiratory membrane, the more diffusion you can have. This is the reason why our lungs aren't just like two big balloons. We don't just have two big air sacs. Then the only place we would have respiratory membrane would be on the outer surface of the lungs. That would give us a really small amount of respiratory membrane. Instead, our lungs are made up of billions of teeny tiny little alveoli, teeny tiny little air sacs that are surrounded by respiratory membrane. So all the respiratory membrane around all the alveoli in both of your lungs gives you a huge amount of respiratory membrane. And that large amount of respiratory membrane is what gives you a fast rate of diffusion between the lungs and the blood. There are a couple of situations where we have a decrease in the amount of respiratory membrane, and one example is in emphysema. Emphysema causes destruction of the walls between the alveoli. So instead of having lots of little alveoli, we break down the walls in between them and we have fewer, larger air sacs. And there are a couple of problems with that. One is just the destruction of some of the respiratory membrane. You have less respiratory membrane, so you have a slower rate of diffusion. The other problem is that these larger alveoli, these larger air sacs, tend to collapse more easily. When you have more collapsed alveoli, then the resistance to airflow is higher, and it's harder to get the air into the lungs to inflate them. So emphysema really has a double whammy of less airflow and less diffusion. The last thing I want to talk about is the idea of ventilation-perfusion coupling, which is really a pretty cool concept, but some people have some trouble with it. Just to put it in straightforward terms, ventilation refers to airflow and perfusion refers to blood flow. For ventilation-perfusion coupling, we want to match the airflow to the blood flow. What that means is we want to have good airflow to areas with good blood flow, and we want to have less airflow to areas with less blood flow. There's no point in bringing a whole lot of air to an area of the lungs with poor blood flow, and there's no point in bringing a whole lot of blood to an area of the lungs that has poor ventilation or poor airflow. So we need to match the airflow and the blood flow, and our lungs do that for us through the process of ventilation-perfusion coupling. An important thing to note about this is we're talking about a local effect. We're not affecting things overall in all the lungs. We're talking about local effects, adjusting the amount of airflow to the amount of blood flow in a specific small area of the lung. I want to start by talking about how we regulate perfusion to match ventilation, and then we'll flip it around. So how do we regulate perfusion or blood flow to match the airflow? To do this, the blood vessels in the lung detect the level of oxygen. If there's a high level of oxygen in the blood, that's an indication that you have good airflow. If there's an area of the lung that has a lower concentration of oxygen in the blood, that's an indication that you have poor airflow in that area. In the pulmonary blood vessels, if you have a high level of oxygen, which indicates good airflow in the area, that causes vasodilation. We increase the size of the blood vessels to bring more blood flow to that area that has good airflow. On the other hand, if you have an area of the lung that has poor airflow, the blood in that area is going to have low levels of oxygen, and that lower level of oxygen causes vasoconstriction of the blood vessels in that area. So if we have good airflow, we dilate the blood vessels to bring more blood to that area of good airflow. If we have an area of poor airflow, we constrict the blood vessels to bring less blood to the area with poor airflow. This way, we get the most blood in the areas that have the most oxygen. It's important to note that this is different than the local control of vasomotion by oxygen in other areas of the body. In other areas of the body, out in your tissues, if the oxygen level is low, that's a signal that you need more blood flow to that area, so we dilate the vessels in those areas. In the lungs, in pulmonary circulation, we have the opposite effect. In pulmonary circulation, Low oxygen is going to cause vasoconstriction, so you move blood away from the low oxygen area, and high oxygen causes vasodilation to bring more blood to the high oxygen areas. Not only can we affect the amount of blood flow to bring more blood to areas with good airflow and less to areas with poor airflow, we can do it the other way around. We can regulate the amount of airflow based on the blood flow to certain areas of the lungs. So this is the other side of ventilation-perfusion coupling. The airways in your lungs can detect the level of carbon dioxide. If you have high carbon dioxide in an area of your lungs, that's an indication that there's a lot of blood flow bringing carbon dioxide to the lungs in that area, and that you need more ventilation to then be able to get that carbon dioxide out of the body. On the other hand, if you have a low level of carbon dioxide in an area of the lung, that's an indication that you're not bringing as much blood to that area, you're not unloading as much carbon dioxide, so you don't need as much airflow in that area of the lung. So, the airways detect the level of carbon dioxide and then respond to that. If you have a high level of carbon dioxide in a certain area of your lung, we already said that indicates a high amount of blood flow to that area, then the high level of carbon dioxide causes bronchodilation to widen the airways in that area for better ventilation to the area that has good circulation. If you have an area of a lung that has poor circulation, maybe there's a blood clot in the area or something like that, poor circulation to a certain area of the lungs is going to cause low levels of carbon dioxide in that area of the lung. The bronchi and bronchioles detect that, and when they detect the low level of carbon dioxide, that causes vasoconstriction. The vasoconstriction makes the airways narrower and brings less airflow to that area of the lung that didn't have good blood flow. So I think it's really cool the way your lungs can match ventilation to perfusion, to match airflow to blood flow.